Good morning, gentlemen. Good morning, George. Good morning, Randall. How are you this morning?
Doing well.
Great. Hey, Bobby.
Thank you for coming on. I appreciate it. On such short notice, I have to tell everybody, I was able to get a hold of these guys just yesterday. I read there was an article that came out in the Miami Herald about the demand letter that I mentioned earlier yesterday. And thank you so much for responding. Thank you so much for spending part of your morning with us. I really appreciate it. I want to get into a little bit about you, gentlemen. I mentioned some background, but I want you to tell your own story. I'll start with you, Randall. You've been an attorney for a long time. And tell our audience a little bit about you, what made you respond to the request from the private bar to create the Florida Justice Institute, if you will.
Well, I went to law school for the sole purpose of becoming a civil rights lawyer. Back in the 60s and early 70s when I graduated from law school, that was people that were really making a difference in today's society were civil rights attorneys. And that was always been my passion. I figured if I wanted to make a lot of money, I'd be a businessman and hire lawyers to work for me. But if I really wanted to make a difference in other people's lives, the way to do it was to become a civil rights lawyer. And I fortunately was hired to start the Florida Justice Institute 37 years ago.
Been a while.
And yeah, it has been a while. And, my first job was to put together a civil rights case challenging conditions of confinement in all of Florida's county jails throughout the state. And I was able to see what a tremendous impact the law can have in terms of changing people's lives and the conditions in Florida's prisons. A lot of Florida's jails at that time were literally dungeons, and people were being locked up, many solely because they couldn't make money bail. And so I thought that was the best way to spend my time as a lawyer. And I've been fortunate to be able to do it for my entire career. And unfortunately, most of my work has been against the Florida Department of Corrections. Florida, as you may know, houses over 100,000 people in its prisons, which constitutes being the third largest prison system in the country. And we are number 3 behind New York and California and Texas. We have surpassed New York. We also hold about 56,000 inmates in our county jail. So Florida is a very punitive state in terms of not only housing a lot of people or warehousing a lot of people, but also keeping them there for long periods of time. So, and as a result of that, we're spending more and more of our limited state revenues for incarcerating people as opposed to educating people and providing them with other things that they need. So it's very unfortunate.
It is. And George, your background, of course, is a little bit different. And tell us a little bit about your background and then your experience and how you wound up working at Dade, et cetera, and what it brought you to now, please.
Well, after I graduated from my master's program in mental health counseling, I went straight into private practice. And due to economic circumstances, I had to seek work elsewhere. And I had a number of jobs, including one counseling at-risk youth in a middle school setting. These were children that were diagnosed with pretty severe psychiatric problems, schizophrenic, major depressive disorder, some of the same things we see from the severely mentally ill that end up in our prison system and part of the mass incarceration we're seeing. From that job, I got a job at the transitional care unit at Dade Correctional Institution. This is in Florida City. So this was a psychiatric ward that catered to inmates coming in from all around the state with a wide range of psychological issues. Some with, pretty mild depression, but serious enough to get them in there. But many others, really, the majority of my caseload actually were severely mentally ill patients. We're talking paranoid schizophrenia, major depressive disorder, paranoid personality disorder, and a host of other really severe diagnoses. And I worked there for nearly 3 years. And towards the end of my tenure, an inmate was actually a patient, was taken into a hallway where there were no cameras, and 4 or 5 guards cuffed him up, threw him to the concrete floor, and just started kicking him. They kicked the crap out of the guy. My coworker came from another direction, and she saw the whole thing, but she was so afraid of retaliation from the guards that on the incident report she wrote down that she didn't see anything. That didn't sit too well with me, and when that patient was in a group of mine, he pulled up his shirt, and you could just see the bruising all over his chest. He turned around. There were bruises on his back. These guards have very heavy boots, and they went at him with a vengeance. And I think if my coworker hadn't come at the time she did, they may have killed this guy. So I filed accurate reports. And then I even had a meeting with the warden, Jerry Cummings, and he asked me to do incident reports. So I was pumping out these reports, and essentially I refused to be silent about the abuse of our patients. And then 2 months later, I was fired. I was the only one in the unit who seemed to care that our patients were being abused. Our efforts as mental health counselors were being sabotaged. And the site manager for Corizon knew all about this, but she took no corrective action.
Yeah, and I want to get into that a little bit here as we go through the myriad of issues that you gentlemen are involved with. I want to first talk about the creation of the coalition. I'll start with you, Randall. The creation of this coalition for purposes of this letter. We had the NAACP, we had the Southern Poverty Law Center, we had the Council of Churches, we had to Stop Prison Abuse, among others. If you could talk a little bit about how that strategy came with and the approach of writing this demand letter to the Department of Justice, please.
It was largely the brainchild of the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU of Florida. Howard Simon basically organized the group in terms of reaching out to the Department of Justice by sending this letter and marshaling the facts that are contained in the letter regarding the numerous inmate deaths that have occurred over the past 5 years. We tried to limit it to the Department of Corrections, but the same thing could be told, of course, about the Department of Juvenile Justice and the deaths that have occurred in that agency as well. But the real focus over the last several years, largely by the media, has been, because I've been litigating these issues, as I said earlier, for 37 years in the courts. But
right.
The main emphasis has been a media blitz, if you will, over the last couple of years, dealing with the deaths that have occurred in Florida's Department of Corrections. Some of these deaths have occurred as a result of the failure of the Department of Corrections to adequately fund its staffing in the institutions. As I said earlier, we have 100,000 inmates in Florida's prisons, but what they've been doing is gradually decreasing the budget for staffing, decreasing the budget for various types of programming in the department. So what you have is largely a Department of Corrections that's just warehousing inmates and not doing anything to make them better, because about 85% of them will eventually be released back into the public. So you would think that there would be a lot of programming going on within the Department of Corrections, but it's quite the opposite. There's very little programming, very little, I heard you talking earlier about prison industries, very little prison industries in Florida's prison system. And a lot of the inmates working in the prison industries are those serving life sentences, and those are the ones that will never go into the workforce to begin with. Up until recently, there's been very little emphasis on reentry. There's been a big federal push of late to improve reentry. So the Department of Corrections is beginning to do some work in reentry, but not enough, certainly. And the other problem has been we have privatized the entire medical and mental health delivery system in Florida. Florida has contracted with two large corporations, one called Horizon, which is the former Prison Health Services and Correctional Medical Services company, which merged in 2011 to become Horizon. But it's the same company, basically the same people involved. They hold contracts on 75% of Florida's prisons, and Wexford Health Sources holds a contract on 25%. So you've got this profit motive that's some would argue is not providing medical care on the basis of increasing profits. And while that might work in the free world, where if you're not getting medical care from your insurance provider, you can go to another carrier. You can't do that in the prison system. You're left at the behest of these two healthcare corporations, and the Department of Corrections has actually found that Horizon wasn't providing and living up to its contract, and they've actually found them in violation of the contract and fined them. But the fines have been very minimal and haven't been sufficient to hold them accountable. So you kind of got this culmination of forces which brought together the 14 signatories to the letter to the Department of Justice. And I'm the former president of the ACLU of Florida and actually hired Howard Simon in 1998. It's probably one of the smarter moves I ever made. And Howard's done a great job. He particularly did a good job in bringing together this group of religious leaders and nonprofit organizations that are concerned about the human rights abuses in Florida's Department of Corrections.
You know, and I'm really glad that you covered the private prison angle too, because we need to really emphasize and you know, the private corporations that are involved in the prison system, as you mentioned, medically, for example, because we know that that's going on in so many places in the country. One of the things that got my attention as to what you guys were trying to do there is 346 deaths in the Florida prison system in 2014. I can't even imagine, you know, that's a crazy number for any place. 46 deaths.
Yeah,
I mean, that's like having the homicide results of a city in the United States, for example, or whatever. That's a lot of people dying in one state, regardless of how many people you have in prison. I'm sure you agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, a large number of them, as you can imagine, as Florida's prisons begins to gray more and more, I mean, a large number of them, you know, are obviously dying of natural causes that are not attributable to lack of medical care or guard on inmate abuse or inmate on inmate abuse. But there were 176 that were not immediately explainable of that 346 deaths. So they have begun to have the Federal Department of Law Enforcement investigate some of these things. But you also have the Florida Medical Examiner's Office that, you know, in certain instances, the medical examiners do a great job in terms of examining these deaths. But in the large number of these deaths, they're kind of unaccountable and unexplainable as to why these people were deceased. There was a very interesting article by a reporter out of the Palm Beach Post probably about 6 to 9 months ago, and she attributed this huge increase in Florida's deaths in the prison system to the privatization of the medical and mental health care. So it's a very,
you know, and I think she's probably right, and I want to get into a little bit more of that. First, I want to switch over to George as well, because again, when we talk about this, the way all of this ties together, and you know, the history of the mental health side of it, tell us a little bit about what you've seen personally and where you see some of the problems from the mental health side, both from incarcerating too many people in our society with mental health and how they're treated inside the system. George, please.
Well, a large segment of the mass incarceration of our population is comprised of the severely mentally ill. Some figures put it at 17%, and what that amounts to is about 400,000 nationwide. For Florida, 17% is 17,000. I can tell you that there are not 17,000 psychiatric beds in the Florida Department of Corrections. So what happens with these severely mentally ill people is that they'll act out consistent with their diagnoses, and guards who are poorly trained, who don't know the difference between a psychotic episode and pretty much a normal behavioral outburst, will put these mentally ill men and women into solitary, and that's contraindicated for the mentally ill. So they're warehousing the mentally ill in solitary confinement. This is just a huge problem. There are thousands of men and women subjected to these conditions, and solitary is a place that we've known from numerous Miami Herald stories where guards abuse inmates with impunity. Oftentimes, cameras aren't working, and when they are working, clever guards will actually block the camera. When they do a cell extraction, they're required to film it. But what these guards will do is they'll block the camera, and then they'll say, well, in all the excitement, oh, this happened. Meanwhile, they're beating the inmate, gassing the inmate, and this is unauthorized punishment. I mean, this violates the 14th Amendment. So this is one of the problems. But as a mental health professional, my focus is on how these people get into the justice system, or as you called it, the legal system, in the first place. We do not have enough state and community mental health options to take care of the severely mentally ill in our communities. And so they end up getting involved with, some of these people are just homeless. They're maybe shoplifted or stole some food. They end up getting into the justice system for petty crimes. And many counties don't have what we have down here in Dade County, Florida, which is a jail diversion program set up by Judge Steve Leifman, by the way. And we try to divert as many severely mentally ill into what community resources we have, which are, very minimal, to keep them out of jail and out of the justice system. Okay, this needs to be pretty much a nationwide effort in all, populated, counties with huge populations. We need to keep these people out of prison in the first place. And I mentioned that I worked in a middle school setting. There are very few safety nets for our children. Our children are subject to all sorts of mental illness. I mentioned schizophrenia, major depressive disorder. I had children on my caseload with bulimia, anorexia, you name it. And the agency that I worked for, their 40-year-plus relationship with the Dade County school system was ended because of financial mismanagement. The school system ran out of money. So Dade County Schools has no intervention program for these at-risk students right now. So these students that are untreated will be young adults, and they'll end up getting into the system, a certain percentage. So that's a focus of my efforts, is to try to keep these people out of justice system in the first place.
And that's a good focus because, of course, we know that we are, as you mentioned, bringing the juvenile part into it. And it is not just the mental health side of it. We're locking up juveniles across the board at an alarming rate in this country. And of course, there are some horrible stories around that. We were talking about yesterday offline, for example, a lot of luckily a lot of media attention to to the judge up in Lucerne County, Pennsylvania, where my son happened to be born. I think about that a lot, and how he was being paid under the table by a private prison juvenile facility to send people there. And, of course, he was incarcerating juveniles at an alarming rate. So there's a lot of corruption involved. And I want to get into a little bit of the corruption as well, because, Randall, I know in your work you run across, a part of the things you run across, of course, is corruption across the board, especially when it comes to transparency and accountability. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about your work in exposing the corruption and trying to make it more transparent as well as accountable.
Well, Florida, to its credit, has one of the better Public Records Act in the nation. I mean, we are the Sunshine State after all.
Right.
But by the same token, there are a couple of things that our Public Records Act turns a blind eye to. And one of them is, as George was talking about earlier, is the filming of these incidents that might happen with the cell extraction that he gave as an example. All of those videotapes, despite the fact that in today's technology you have video cameras throughout the prisons and throughout other governmental buildings to film, as you say, corruption or misdeeds by correctional officers, those tapes are all considered security, and they're exempt from the Public Records Act. That is a major problem. So, for example, the Miami Herald right now has a lawsuit pending in circuit court in Tallahassee, challenging the state on declaring that these videotapes taken within a prison system are exempt from the Public Records Act. So that's a problem in terms of exposing corruption and misdeeds in the correctional system. The other thing that they're now using is the HIPAA laws that Congress enacted to health information. It's an acronym: Health Information Portable Affordable Care. I think I've described it correctly, but the HIPAA laws now are being used by governmental agencies to keep people from being able to determine on a class basis, for example, various and sundry things that are going on. So, for example, these for-profit companies will use the HIPAA statute as a defense to providing medical records to journalists who are trying to investigate things that are going on, even if they redact the name of the person so their individual health information is not made known to the media. It nonetheless, they use it as a defense to providing these records to someone doing investigative journalism. And there are a number of things. There are all kind of other problems within the system that make it very difficult for the media to be able to be the public's eyes and ears in terms of looking at what's going on within a Department of Corrections or within a county jail, for example. So it's becoming more and more difficult for the media to be able to be the eyes and ears for the public, and couple that with the demise of newspapers across this country, which is a whole nother problem we have in our society, because we're losing a lot of the great investigative journalists. The person that has really done a fantastic job here in Florida is Julie Brown with the Miami Herald, and she's helped expose a lot of the problems that have been going on within the Florida Department of Corrections, and Pat Beal at the Palm Beach Post, and there are other journalists all over the state. But those journalists are becoming few and far between as our newspapers are gobbled up by large corporations, and they're being spun off and downsized as people turn to digital journalism, but they're not willing to
Right.
pay for the newspaper. And it's becoming a real problem in today's society in terms of being able to do investigative journalism.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. The media, as we've seen in our lifetime, has essentially become here's what you should think instead of here's what is happening type of medium due to what you describe, as well as getting the orders from the top, and of course having a lot of the government intervention as to what they're talking about and making money. Again, another profit
Right.
model. And I implore people to look to alternative media outlets to find, because there seems to be a lot more interest from the journalists in the alternative media for whatever reason. A lot of them are activists like myself that want to expose what the state is doing to people all around the world. I will say that I did. When you mentioned the fight to get records, I did see a case that was decided upon recently in federal court, not in Florida, but that the judge came out and said that the FOIA laws do not apply to the private prisons. And this was against the private prisons, for example. And I of course, I was stunned, considering that, what that does to the problem that you just described when it comes to the medical industry, the privatized medical industries, and for the lack of transparency by the journalists. And if judges are going to rule that way, and that just makes this that much more crazy, because in 1983, as you know better than I, you need to gather as much evidence you have to prove the case, and FOIA is one of the ways that you do that, of course. And
Right.
Have you seen that, or what? Besides what you described, have you seen that, or what's your feeling about where that might go?
Well, FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, is the federal equivalent of what Florida has, which is the Public Records Act. As I said earlier, our Public Records Act is broad enough to include these for-profit prison care providers. So we don't have that problem within Florida's, in terms of the state institutions or the county institutions that have been privatized. As it pertains perhaps to the federal prisons, and we do have some very large federal prisons in Florida. We have one of the largest in the country. It's called Coleman. It's a federal prison northwest of Orlando. It's
Right.
got several prisons on this large complex, and they've got close to 7,000 inmates. It's in this one facility. So, we do have that same problem, but that pertains to the FOIA laws. The FOIA laws that you described are not as transparent as our state Public Records Act, which is very unfortunate. If you make a FOIA request of a federal agency, largely they redact almost every single thing in it, and you can barely figure out what you're reading because of the fact that they black everything out, and so it's very difficult to even read what is finally presented to you, and it usually takes a year or longer to get the documents. So it's unfortunate.
That's crazy stuff,
Congress,
considering that obviously the justice the prison system and all of the case law that happened, particularly during the Warren Court, which a lot of the stuff, Johnson v. Avery and Wolf v. McDonald and Bounds v. Smith, all these cases that I know you're intimately familiar with, was the basis of the direction toward transparency, one would think, considering what those cases were about. And here we are regressing again into that.
Yeah.
And I find, what you do is got to be very frustrating to a degree, considering that what you're trying to, it should be a lot easier to expose injustice than it is in our society when it comes to dealing with correctional officers and police officers. Yeah,
a lot of the problems have been presented by Congress. Congress, during Newt Gingrich's reign in Congress, in 1996, they passed the Prison Litigation Reform Act, which was an effort by Congress to limit federal court oversight into state and local correctional facilities. And that has had a huge impact on keeping the federal courts out of regulating and making certain that correctional officials obey the Constitution. We see case after case after case that never makes it to see the light of day because of the Prison Litigation Reform Act, and that is in large measure owed to Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton. Obviously, Bill.
Right. No, I know you're right. There's no doubt.
Signed it into law, and so it was a major. It's become a major impediment to prison reform litigation in this country.
We don't call him Bill Clinton around here. We call him Slick Willie. I haven't thought of a good one for Newt yet. I don't know if one exists. just so you know. So, and George, getting into the mental health side again, and we talked offline a little bit about how, for example, back when St. Reagan became president, and he immediately threw out the mental health legislation that had been just passed that would have kept money in the mental health community. And you mentioned some of that, but what is important here from about your book, for example, and I want you to talk a little bit about your book because we haven't gotten into that at all. Just tell us about how to get away with murder.
Well, just to speak to your point on the mental health issue, when we started closing down psychiatric facilities and community mental health facilities for lack of funding, and that started in the 60s and 70s, some of those facilities were horrific in their treatment of patients, and they were rightly closed down. But there was no plan with what to do with the patients that were in those facilities. So they started to come in contact with law enforcement and then the criminal justice system. And basically, we have, in fact, returned to the Middle Ages. We are rounding up the mentally ill. We're throwing them into, in some situations, dungeons where they're being beaten, tortured, and killed. We've returned to the Middle Ages. This is just something that I think as Americans and as a people that are concerned with human rights, we need to pay attention to our own business. We're so busy pointing our fingers at all these other countries and screaming, "Oh, human rights abuses." Well, let's take care of our own business first.
Right.
As far as the book
George,
is, go ahead,
George, if I may. Part of the deinstitutionalization that was done in the 60s and 70s was done because of the advent of psychotropic medication, and the idea was to create community-based mental health treatment for these people coming out of these institutions, and to provide them with psychotropic medication and other meds so they could function in the community. But the problem is society never funded adequately community mental health.
Right.
Exactly. And in terms of the book I wrote, I had been fired for not staying silent about the abuse of our patients. And 10 months later, my coworker called me with a shocking call, and the first 3 words out of her mouth were, "They killed him." And that was Darren Rainey. Guards put him into a shower where he had no control over the water temperature. They jacked it up to as high as it would go, which was 180 degrees, and they boiled the man to death. And I wasn't one to sit silent in prison, and I certainly wasn't one to stay silent about Darren Rainey. And I took certain steps to get him justice. A month after he died, I had a sit-down with 2 FBI agents who interviewed me. The FBI passed on an investigation. That was 3 years ago. So in response to that and a lot of other dead ends I encountered while trying to get Rainey justice was to write a book about my experiences as a psychotherapist in the state prison psychiatric unit. And I wanted to give people an inside view of what happens to the mentally ill in our prison system. I wanted to expose what happens. Many patients on my caseload, their progress was sabotaged by guards. I'll give you a quick example. I had a man on my caseload who initially was eating his own feces. He was paranoid schizophrenic, and my coworker managed to get him to start taking meds. The turnaround was nothing short of miraculous. I mean, he could speak to me like we're talking right now. He made terrific progress. I got him. He never went out to rec. He didn't come to groups. He started doing a lot of things in the unit and taking advantage of what few positive activities there were. And so what happened was this one particular guard came by his cell constantly, taunting him, tormenting him about his crime, calling him all sorts of names like, for example, the worst thing you can be in prison is a pedophile. And this guard would come by and call him a diaper sniper, child molester, Chester for short. Chester is a prison slang for child molester. And, he's saying it loud enough where all the other inmates could hear it. And he complained to me numerous times. I told my supervisor about it, the site manager for Horizon, did nothing. And in my book, I call her Dr. Do Nothing. So then one day, my patient is being moved from his cell, and the guard who's been taunting him is holding a box of his property. In other words, the guard had both his hands full. My patient hauled off and hit him in the nose. He broke his nose. There was blood everywhere. So here was a guy who was making great progress, it was sabotaged by this guard, because now my patients hit a guard. Okay, that's more charges that they can put on the guy. Then from there he gets transferred, you guessed it, solitary confinement.
Yeah.
So this is what happened on my unit on a regular basis. Guards sabotaged my efforts as a mental health counselor.
Right. And then they have to deal with not only new charges in the criminal justice system if they decide to refer, but there's also the, quote, due process, end quote, that they have inside where they're charged and put. The segregation is not administrative after they're found guilty of that process, and they're in disciplinary solitary confinement as opposed to administrative segregation, which I think is not talked about enough, the way that is created. And again, the sabotage is ridiculous. Gentlemen, I have some callers that are asking to ask some questions, and if you don't mind, I'm going to have one come in and see what the question is. I have a couple of Skype callers, so I don't know where they're calling from, but I'm going to bring the first one in. Hello, welcome to I Take Liberty with My Coffee. What's your name, where you're calling from, and what's your question, please?
Yes, thank you for taking my call. I'm calling from Colorado. My name is Ethel. Excuse me. And I know George Mallinckrodt. Hi, George.
Hey, Ethel.
Oh, wonderful.
I got your email this morning. Very excited to listen to this show, because what you guys are talking about is so very important. And it is something that, of course, George knows all about a Just Cause organization here in Colorado Springs that's working for people that's been wrongly convicted and so forth. But I wanted to just make a brief statement. I understand, all the abuse that you're talking about and everything that's going on within the Florida Departments of Corrections. However, it is so bad here within the federal system. And the problem is we're working for 6 guys that have been wrongly convicted that are sitting in a prison camp here in Florence, Colorado, called the IRP 6, these 6 guys. And their families are being abused constantly. These guys are being abused, their families. We actually had a situation where a gentleman passed away in September. The Bureau of Prison at the camp said that the man committed suicide. His family is fighting this thing because this guy did not commit suicide. The prison ended up cremating the man, and they wanted to do it even before the family had an opportunity to even see his body. And we have done press release after press release about what's going on here, and Pastor Samuels is not concerned with this whatsoever. We have made trip after trip after trip on the Hill to Washington, D.C. We tried to get to the director of prisons, Samuels. They kicked our group out. They said they had an open door policy, but they kicked the group out. They didn't want to see him because of the press releases that Just Cause has been sending as to what is going on within this system. And my question to you guys is, and I don't know if you can help me with this, when the Federal Bureau of Prisons director does not want to listen when people are calling out, when the families are being abused every single time they go to visit their inmate relatives, who do you talk to? You have a camp director who's sitting there telling these guards how to mistreat these families. And I'm talking 16-year-old kids that the guards are actually touching. That is assault. This is these guys as kids and their families that these people are abusing. What do you do, and how do you go about getting somebody to listen to this?
Amazing.
Well, that's a good question.
Randall, would you like to answer that first?
Sure.
Thank you for your question.
I deal with that all the time. Family members that are having problems with correctional systems, short of a lawsuit, and we have done those on behalf of family or girlfriends or fiancés getting to see their loved ones who are in prison. But I think probably the most effective way in terms of dealing with it federally would be to write the congressman or congresswoman from the Florence, Colorado area or wherever these people live, and say, I'm a constituent, I vote, and I'm having this problem and I need your help. By shining a light on that, usually Congress people are pretty responsive in terms of asking the Justice Department, and the Justice Department is in charge of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, asking the Justice Department to investigate and to find out what's going on. And more often than not, that should eliminate the problem. I mean, this is the sort of thing that ought to be dealt with at a fairly low level. It shouldn't resort in a federal lawsuit.
What you described...
and for those who don't know about Florence, just to add a little to the background, Florence is the prison facility that was built, and then there's a couple of them. It's not just one prison, but that's the Supermax that was built some years ago, where they house all of these allegedly fantastically dangerous prisoners in a lockdown situation all the time. It's not that there's a process where they have ad seg or protective custody or disciplinary seg. It is a 23-hour-a-day lockdown facility, the Florence Max. And then, of course, they have camps. And a lot of the federal prisons that are in maximum security, like Lewisburg, which is considered level 6, and Terre Haute and Lompoc in the country, they have also federal prison camps outside. And they kind of help maintain those maximum security prisons from a work standpoint. And it's crazy to have people treated like that. And thank you so much for your question. George, would you like to chime in on that as well?
Well, what Ethel said about family members and visitation holds true in Florida as well. I'm in contact with a number of people who visit their loved ones on the inside, and this one mother told me that a female guard basically groped her genitals, and the prison officials are allowed to do a frisk, but inappropriate touching of genitals is not allowed. And what happens is this mother is afraid to raise this issue because of retaliation. Her son could be put into solitary, and the guards will make it known, treat this man poorly. So they're basically in prison, inmates are powerless, their families are powerless for the most part, and there's a culture of disrespect. aside from the culture of brutality. So these men and women that are in our prisons are treated very disrespectfully every single day. They're made to eat crow. In other words...
Did we lose
Hello?
you, George? George? I'm not hearing him at the moment.
I'm not either.
Yeah. Oh, and there he's gone. Okay. So we'll wait for George to come back, of course, and we'll move on to our next question from one of our callers. Hello. You're on I Take Liberty with MyCoffee.com. What is your name, where you're calling from, and what's your question or comment, please?
My name is Lamont Banks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. I'm actually executive director of A Just Cause. I know George as well. And I think
and
to
George
the point...
is back online.
Okay. And George, if you can hear me, it's Lamont. I'm also host of AJC Radio. We had the opportunity to have George on our program in regards to the abuse that happened to the young man in Florida and the guards laughing as they cooked this man to death. I want to make a point, if I may, and I'll make sure it'll be a brief
Please.
comment. In regards to the Florence situation, and I think the gentleman on the panel alluded to that they are known as a super max facility, housing the most horrific, what our society calls the most horrific people who have violated laws. I think the problem we have here is going to the case of Mr. Michael Anderson. He is the gentleman that we believe, and the family has contacted us in regards to the death of this man, 44 years old, getting out in 2 years. You know what I mean? It's not someone that is being in prison for a huge amount of time where they feel like we have no way out. Suicide is the answer. This is a man whose wife was coming to visit him. His mother saw him the day before this supposed suicide. He was telling his dad, "I'm excited, Dad, to get out, to go job hunting and all these things." On that side of the coin, we believe, based upon the stand that A Just Cause has taken, is that there are acts of retaliation to the IRP6 families every single week. There is some type of harassment, some type of abuse, and this is the danger. If I can just make this quick point, the danger is that when you stand up and fight against this type of situation where you got a young man dying. Well, then, you know what? The families of the IRP6 who harassed every single day for 3 years of visiting, we have to raise the question, man, if they killed this young man who had 2 years to go, well, the harassment level that's hit the IRP6 and their families is at such a astronomical level. Who says that these men are not going to be in danger? Who says we don't feel 6 more body bags down there in Florence? Right. So I think this is the thing that is so alarming, that this is even happening in a place we call America, and while the director sits and does nothing. The director sits and this is so alarming to me, and excuse my emotion. It is so outrageous when you hear people are dying. I would contend and offer and suggest body cameras be in every federal and state prison on correctional officers in solitary confinement. Put them on them. And you know what? As far as the privacy, because it's security, if there is a questionable act that takes place, such as this, unexplained deaths, when you told me the number, you guys quoted the number of 300, did I hear that right? 347 people?
Yeah, 1 year in Florida, 346.
That is insanity. But body cameras, forced and implemented by the federal and state government, making that mandatory. Guess what? I bet you see a little bit of a difference. And then when somebody dies all of a sudden who has no reason to be dead, let's pull the body cameras. Let's see what happened. And can you answer, and this is the question I'm going to pose to you, and I'm going to get off the phone. Can anybody tell me when the federal government or state government begin to become funeral directors and cremate bodies, offer the cremation services and casket services and whatever services? My understanding, according to the guidelines of the Bureau of Prisons at the federal level, and the state normally follows what federal does, that body has to be released to the family immediately. That's not they're no longer in the custody of the state or the federal government at the time of death. That's when they've been released, so to speak. Please, can somebody answer that question for me? I don't know of a statistic. I don't know of a case where the federal government says we want to do a nice thing and cremate your son, unless there's some definite acts of cover-up here of what exactly happened to that body. Thanks for taking my call.
That sounds like a cover-up
Randall,
to me.
go ahead and jump right in there. Thank you for your question.
The law, at least in Florida, is you can't cremate someone within, I think it's 7 days at a minimum, and the reason for that is to give law enforcement an opportunity to investigate the cause of death, and that stands to reason, certainly. In Florida, if a loved one dies in prison, the correctional official is supposed to, it doesn't always happen, is supposed to call the family and give the family the opportunity to make arrangements to take custody of the body and have a family funeral, whether it be through cremation or through a casket in a cemetery. If that doesn't happen, then the usual course is the state does cremate the body. Now, it may be different in Florence, Colorado. I don't know what the law is in Colorado.
Well, actually, it would be, considering it's a federal prison, it would fall into the BOP guidelines, without a doubt.
Right.
And I'll offer this, as somebody who has studied the BOP and been involved in working on cases with organizations, including the ACLU, on cases against the federal government. The BOP has always been a plethora of nepotism, for example. I mean, just look up the Cohen family, for example, in the Federal Bureau of Prisons industry. When you look at the things that happened under Norman Carlson's reign as the director of the BOP, I'm not surprised to hear that. What is interesting here, of course, is that getting back to the administrative standpoint and how what goes on in prisons is just not thought of or dealt with by our elected officials. We have a president who's a constitutional professor who talked about these things when he was elected, and then when he gets elected, it falls by the wayside. These people work for him, and of course, as Randall was talking about with congressmen, which is always a way to go, hopefully to get Congress to do it. But again, and then you talk about money in politics and Unicor lobbying and Correctional Corporation of America lobbying. We are really up against it, but we have no choice but to fight. Those are our neighbors, our friends, our family members, and we as a society, I think what we should do is call people out for their lack of compassion of human rights. Because I think one of the problems that we've had in our society is we have grown apathetic to compassion. I talk about this a lot with cannabis. The medical use of marijuana. If it helps people, why isn't everybody talking about it? Because we don't argue with people who want to go get a Rolade to battle nauseous, but we're going to have a problem with somebody who smokes a joint to battle chemotherapy. All of this is relevant to our compassion or lack thereof, and we decide to turn a blind eye to what goes on behind the prison walls for a long time. And then one last thing I'll say about this, especially with Florence, is we're not training these guys properly. We're not vetting the people that are being hired as correctional officers either. You're just throwing anybody in there and not telling them what the rules are and not enforcing what the rules are that are even there. And I offer that to everybody. Randall, I want to ask you a question relative to the prison population. When I brought up cannabis, because I want to lead into that, one of the big issues and one of the alleged things that are on the table in this election is the war on drugs and that failure. I believe it's a failure. I don't know what your opinion is of it, but I believe it's a failure. And then, of course, we have all of these people who are incarcerated for simple possession of marijuana at such a high percentage. I know there were 800,000 people arrested for marijuana crimes in 2013, and 600,000 of them were for simple possession, for example. What's your opinion about the war on drugs and cannabis and that part of the incarceration cycle that you have in Florida, for example?
Well, it's a relatively small percent of the people that are in prison are for smoking marijuana. I think certainly the war on drugs has driven up the size of America's prison population. I mean, we're 5% of the world's population, but yet we incarcerate 25% of the people that are incarcerated in the world. So, we definitely over-incarcerate. How much is that attributable to the war on drugs? It's a smaller percentage, I think, what is being led to believe in the media. I mean, in the debates the other night with Hillary Clinton, she's attributing a large percentage of it to the war on drugs, and the smoking of cannabis. But I think it's not as great as a lot of politicians seem to believe. Nonetheless, it's wonderful to see that people are beginning to talk about smart justice and the fact that we over-incarcerate in this country, and we need to take a look at the sentencing laws, not just drug laws, but all sentencing laws, because the United States over-incarcerates to the max, and that's why we have such a huge prison population in this country. But again,
we have jurisdictions that have abolished parole, including a federal jurisdiction. We have longer sentences.
Florida. Yeah.
And so everybody's doing all of they're handing out 15 years or more like it's candy, and then you have to sit and do 85% of the sentence, and there's no rehabilitation on top of that. So, and then it just keeps increasing. I will offer to you, though, that it has been reported that 53% of the federal population is incarcerated for drugs of some sort, and the majority of that percentage is for possession as opposed to the sale of drugs. This is reported by the Department of Justice as far as the federal system is concerned. George, what's your comments on as far as that is concerned?
I think really we need to start spending our money, our tax dollars more wisely. We're financing the prison industrial complex at a staggering amount, and what's happening is we don't spend the money early in people's lives. I talked about programs of intervention for our children, young adults. Every dollar we spend early, we're going to save $2, $3, $4 down the road. Because if we keep these people out of the criminal justice system, and some of these, 80% of people who get mental health treatment actually improve. And so if we can help to turn these people around, and some percentage will become actually productive members of our society. In fact, I'm in communication with a man here in Miami. His name is Carlos. He's a recovering schizophrenic. And what that means is it's a permanent situation for him. He's on medication. He gets counseling. He goes to support groups. He's in college now to become a nurse, and he looks forward to graduating and getting a job. And he's one of the fortunate ones, the fortunate few that was able to get treatment, and his mother never gave up to him. Gave up on him. That's a whole other story.
Sure.
But that's just an example of what we can do if we fund our community and state mental health treatment resources. We can help people like that, and then in the long run save a ton of money.
Fantastic. I want to thank the two of you for coming on my show today. I think that these are as important as subjects that exist in our society. And what I'd like you guys to do, if you would, please, is give me a couple of minute closing as to what you think my audience and all audiences out there need to hear about anything you want to talk about, essentially. Go ahead, Randall.
Sure. I think, apropos to our conversation today, I think hopefully your audience will keep pressure on politicians to continue the talk that has begun in the last couple of years about smart justice, about the need to reform not just the drug laws, but also all criminal laws to make certain that the punishment fits the crime and that we are not keeping people in prison or jail for longer periods of time that are necessary, that we're spending entirely too much money dealing with incarcerating people in this country. We need to come back to reality here that our money, our limited tax dollars, are better spent educating people, rehabilitating people, and making certain that they don't go to a life of crime or don't go back to a life of crime. And as George said earlier, the other important aspect is to keep people out of the criminal justice system who are mentally ill and have them dealt with in a community-based treatment facilities where they can get the treatment that they need and they don't need to be placed in a very punitive and costly program called the Department of Corrections, no matter what state you're in.
Fantastic. Thank you, Randall. And George.
Yes. I'd like to address your listeners, and just by virtue of listening to this program, you're becoming better informed as to the conditions behind the bars. What I've found when I speak to people in our communities is that very few in Florida knew about Darren Rainey and the over 80 stories that the Miami Herald has published about the culture of brutality. And so an informed citizen is an agent for change. As Randall said, these people who know what's going on can contact their representatives, their senators, and put pressure on them to change the system, which obviously is very, very broken. So that's my message. Get out there, get informed, and there's so many coalitions and groups. Join a group. We have a group in Miami called SPAN, Stop Prison Abuse Now. Join that group. Become a member of the movement for change in our prison systems nationwide.
Yeah, and that is a very, very good point. And just so you know, I am a member of the group that George just said. After meeting George, I dove right in because I think it's important to do exactly what he just said. Gentlemen, thank you so much for coming on the show. And let me tell you that anything that happens involving those issues or anything like it, please feel free to let me know, let the coffee party know. We have a big social media bat. This will definitely be passed around, and it'll hit a lot of news feeds, and hopefully people will pay attention to it and reach out to the organizations involved and read the stories that go around, and just Google search prison abuse and prison deaths and the things that are going on, because there are stories about what is happening in jails. You know, Sandra Bland, which was a big story about something that happened in a jail, for example, regardless of what the results were. And there are others. There was one recently in Louisiana. So thank you so much for sharing, you know, what's important to you and sharing your work that is going on in Florida and your efforts to expose the corruption and the abuses that are going on and making them transparent. I appreciate you and your time on a Sunday morning.
Thanks for having me on.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Certainly, and you guys take care.
Thank you.
So, you know, as I emphasize, everybody, for me, this important issue, again, like I said, you know, to the audience, do your research. You know, take a look at it. You know, is it something that you've known about? Is it something that you think should be part of your life? You know, is it something you want to talk about? Because again, when you talk about what's going on in this country, one of the problems is lack of compassion. I truly believe that. You know, regardless of the party allegiances and the discussion of the politics, you know, it is clear that from a party standpoint, neither party gives a damn on a daily basis as to what's going on, because all of these states and the federal government, you know, the people who are in power rotate, you know, both in Congress, you know, for example, and the presidency, they rotate. And yet we're seeing these abuses happen under both watches, which is important. You know, and things like this is where, you know, I emphasize that there is not a difference in party because of that. And I get some of the differences that there are, I really do. But when it comes down to the money, when it comes down to, there's a lot of money made in the prison industry, private prison industry, public prison industry. There's a lot of money being made. And, you know, to treat people like this, you know, for the examples that was given at the Florence situation by the woman Ethel that had called in, for example, these are egregious. You know, these are your fellow citizens. This is important. And the only way that it stops is if we make them stop. It's just